My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium on religion and democracy in the foreign policy of the Obama administration. The center was created some 3.5 years ago within the Office of the President as part of a university-wide initiative to foster the interdisciplinary study of religion as it intersects with global policy challenges of diplomacy and democracy, of development and dialogue. In keeping with the university's Catholic and Jesuit identity, we approach religion as something important, not just one factor among others, but as a source of individual motivation, of community identity, of ethical and value commitment that plays out in policy and politics in different ways, in complex ways that we're just beginning to understand. Some of you have been involved with some of our programs in the past, and it's great to see some familiar faces today as we continue this conversation. The Henry Luce Foundation has provided support for today's symposium. We've been partnering with them and with the School of Foreign Service over the last couple of years to build knowledge that is designed to inform better policy at this intersection of religion and world affairs. We've had a number of symposia and publications on the religious sources of foreign policy, on international religious freedom, and the like. We published some recommendations to the new administration several months ago, and now, exactly 1 year after Obama's election, is a wonderful opportunity to sort of take stock and look ahead. The person who has been guiding our efforts in this area is Tom Farr, to my left, who I think is known to most all of you. I won't give an in-depth introduction before turning things over to him, only to mention that he is a visiting professor in the School of Foreign Service and a senior fellow at the Berkley Center, where he directs our program on religion and U.S. foreign policy. He has a long and distinguished diplomatic career behind him and has now published a number of important works in the area of U.S. foreign policy and religion, particularly with respect to issues of religious freedom. His book, World of Faith and Freedom, you can see over there on the table. So, with no further delay, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Tom Farr.
Well, thanks, Tom. Let me add my welcome to all of you to the campus of Georgetown University. We have many giants who will be talking to you today, but I want to acknowledge one that's not on the podium is here today, and that's my dear friend and colleague, Jose Casanova, who is here with us. Anybody who is working in this field knows of Jose's book, Public Religions in the Modern World, 1994, a classic at the time, and it remains so. Jose, thanks for joining us today. This is the sixth, I'm just trying to count, I think the sixth in a series of conferences that we've had on religion and U.S. foreign policy, sponsored by the Berkley Center. And if you're interested, there are pamphlets in the back that will give you an insight into each one of them. For example, we had a couple of years ago one on constitution building and the consolidation of democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we had a fascinating debate between Muqtadar Khan and Princeton professor Robert George. A few months later, we had one on Israel as a religious democracy, and we had 3 rabbis, including one from Michael Melchior, a member of the Knesset at the time, come and talk about Judaism in the public square in Israel. That, as you can imagine, was a fascinating debate. Then last year, we had 3 symposia on the 10th anniversary of the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, which, as many of you know, mandated the promotion of religious freedom as an aspect of U.S. foreign policy. So we looked at the past, present, and future of that policy. Out of that came a booklet with excerpts from the vigorous and rich discussion that we had, which you can look at in the back, and also a policy prescriptive publication entitled The Future of U.S. International Religious Freedom Policy Recommendations for the Obama Administration. We're low on those. We don't have hard copies, but you can download the PDF from the Berkley Center website if you're interested. Co-authored by me and my colleague Dennis Hoover, who is the editor of the Review of Faith and International Affairs. This brings us to our topic today, which is, of course, religion and democracy in U.S. foreign policy and the policy of the Obama administration. Now, for the younger among you, this is a very controversial subject, but those of us of a certain age know that the United States has been trying to promote democracy in one form or another for at least a century. I mean, one can go back at least to Woodrow Wilson, and certainly to the establishment of the National Endowment for Democracy in the early 1980s, since which we have spent literally billions of dollars attempting to implant the seeds of a democracy, the institutions and habits of democracy, for a fairly simple and straightforward reason, because I think most of us would agree that democracy, when stable and lasting, is good for its citizens and it's good for the interests and the security of the United States. First President Bush and President Clinton continued this, and of course President George W. Bush, in the post-9/11 part of his presidency, adopted a form of democracy promotion which has become very controversial and which will certainly play a role in our discourse today. And as we speak, the Obama administration, I think, is trying to decide how it wants to treat this issue. So we're going to focus on what might be thought of as a narrow slice of this, but I think it's a major slice of the question of democracy and how successful it can be and whether it can root, and that is the relationship between religion and democracy, not only in theory, we're going to do a little of that, but also in practice. We're going to have 4 panels to look at this issue. We're going to begin with one that I will introduce in just a moment that will look at a particular way of thinking about the relationship between religion and democracy called the twin tolerations, and we're fortunate enough to have the author of that concept with us. Then in the second panel this morning, we're going to turn to the question of the emerging data on this subject. What do the empirical sociologists and others have to say? There's not a lot of work on this, but there's some very important work, and we have a couple of the pioneering people who are looking at this, in fact, 3 of them in that emerging data panel. Then we're going to have a keynote address at lunch by the former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar, a friend of Georgetown, a friend of the United States, which I'm sure is going to be a fascinating address. Then following lunch, our third panel will take a look at the subject of religion and democracy promotion in American foreign policy. Here we will have some of the policy makers and thinkers and practitioners that have actually sort of had, if you like, boots on the ground on this issue. And then, of course, we will end the day with perhaps the hottest topic of all, the question, thinking about Islam and democracy, and some of the best thinkers in the world will be on that panel. So this is going to be an exciting day. I welcome you again. I hope you can stay the whole day, but if you have to leave, please come back. We're delighted to have you. Let me introduce the first panel, which I have the honor of moderating myself, and not a lot of moderating is going to be necessary, as you'll see. We're going to look at this concept of the twin tolerations. And our first speaker is going to be the guy who put this idea on the map, and that is Professor Alfred Stepan of Columbia University, sitting to my left, who will speak first. In the year 2000, an essay came out in the Journal of Democracy entitled Religion, Democracy, and the Twin Tolerations. And those of us who work in this field have thought deeply about this. I use this essay in my courses at Georgetown, and we spend an awful lot of time in engaging the richness of this fairly small article, which is just packed with ideas. So we'll hear from Professor Stepan first, who's going to kind of update his thinking about this for us. Then we're going to turn to one of the primary public intellectuals in the United States, indeed in the world, Jean Bethke Elshtain, who is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago, but far more importantly, in my view, a senior fellow at the Berkley Center, and also a holder of the Dorothy and Thomas Levy Chair in the Foundations of American Freedom here at Georgetown University. And I eagerly look forward to what Professor Elshtain has to say about the twin tolerations as a way of thinking about this issue in American foreign policy. And then sort of bringing up the rear, and as we say, last but not least, is one of the brightest scholars in this field that I know. And that is Timothy Samuel Shah. And most of you know Tim, you know his work. He is affiliated with Boston University, He's a research scholar with the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs there, and to my delight has been recently awarded a grant by the Commission on International Religious Freedom to think seriously about some of the issues that they encounter, and those of you who know this field know that the Commission on International Religious Freedom needs some assistance in thinking about these issues. Is there anybody here from the Commission that was insulted by that? I didn't see anybody, so I went ahead and said it. So, without further ado, our panel on twin tolerations begins with Al Stepan. Al?
Okay, thank you, Tom, and thank everyone for being here. It was 10 years ago that I wrote it, and the twin tolerations, and I've been working and updated in some ways, but I'm going to basically start out with just what I consider the absolute fundamentals of it. What are the minimal core institutional and political requirements a polity must satisfy before it should be considered a democracy? A necessary condition is free and contested elections of the sort discussed by Robert A. Dahl in his classic book, Polyarchy. For these conditions to be satisfied, Dahl argues that 8 institutional guarantees for political freedom are required, including the freedom for groups and individuals to form and join organizations. And then many of the other 8 institutional guarantees follow from this to compete in elections and so on. Now, my colleague and I, Juan Lin's frequent co-author, accept the 8 Dahlian institutional guarantees as a necessary, but not as a sufficient condition of democracy. Not sufficient because no matter how free and fair the elections, and no matter how large the majority of the government, democracy is not simply majoritarian. The political society produced by such an election must write a constitution that itself is democratic, in that it respects fundamental rights, liberties, which include, among other things, considerable protections for minority rights. Furthermore, the democratically elected government must rule within the boundaries of the Constitution and be bounded by the law and a complex set of vertical and horizontal institutions, many supported by civil society, that help ensure accountability. It should be clear that democracy cannot be consolidated in a country unless, among other things, there's an opportunity for the development of a robust and critical civil society that helps check the state and constantly generates alternatives. But of course, democracy is a system of conflict regulation that allows open competition over values and goals that citizens want to advance. In a strict democratic sense, this means that as long as groups do not use violence, do not violate the rights of other citizens, and advance their interests within the rules of the democratic game, all groups, including religious groups, are granted the right to advance their interests both in civil society and in political society. This is the minimal institutional statement of what democratic politics entails and does not entail. Building upon this core threshold approach to democracy, what does this imply about religion, politics, and democracy in the twin toleration? Specifically, what are the necessary rough boundaries of freedom for elected governments from religious groups and for religious individuals and groups from government? The key area of autonomy that must be established for democratic institutions is that the institutions that emanate from democratic procedures be able, within the bounds of the Constitution and human rights, to generate policies. Religious institutions should not have constitutionally privileged prerogatives which allow them authoritatively to mandate public policy to democratically elected governments. The key area of autonomy, the other part of the twin tolerations, from the government or even from other religions that must be established for religious freedom, is that individuals and religious communities, consistent with our core institutional definition of democracy, must have complete freedom to worship privately. But of course it means more than this. As individuals and groups, they should also be able to publicly advance their values in civil society and to sponsor organizations and movements in political society as long as their public advancement of these beliefs does not impinge negatively on the liberties of other citizens or violate democracy and the law by violence. This core institutional approach to democracy necessarily implies that no group in civil society, including religious groups, can a priori be prohibited from forming a party. Constraints on political parties may only be imposed after the party, by its actions, violates democracy. The judgment as to whether or not a party violates democracy should be decided not by parties in the government, but by courts. Within this broad framework of the minimal freedom for the democratic state and the minimal religious freedom of citizens and religions, it would appear that from a purely theoretical perspective, that there can be an extraordinarily broad range of concrete patterns of religious state relations in political systems that would meet our minimal definitions of a democracy. Note, the core institutional definition I've just given of democracy and the role of religion in it says nothing about any imperative that religion be confined to the private sphere or prohibited from entering the public sphere. Dahl's right to organization implies entry and participation within the public sphere. That seems to be pretty clear. Now, let me just very briefly go over some classic ideas that complicate what I think is pretty simple twin tolerations. These two ideas, of course, are secularism and separation of church and state. What do they imply and not imply? Secularism first. Political science does not have a Nobel Prize, but we do have a prize like it. It's called the Skepti Prize. Now, what's interesting is that the first three winners of this prize were Robert Dahl, Juan J. Lenz, and Aaron Leipart. Now, all three of them won for their analyses of the comparative analysis of democracy. Okay? Not one of them, when you go into the index of their basic books on democracy, ever discusses secularism. It's not in the index of any of their books. The reason for this, there are many reasons. They obviously accept Jose Casanova's idea that a degree of functional differentiation of authoritative structures is necessary for democracy. But confining religion to the private sphere, they do not see as normatively necessary, and they don't even talk about it because it's obvious. And they don't, and obviously secularism from above, which we've seen in many places in the world, weakens the emergence of democratic relationships and practices. Linz doesn't like it because virtually every type of country in the world at one time or another, whether Saddam Hussein or Ba'athist in Syria or in Tunisia, have called themselves secular. It doesn't add anything to any. When we went through the 5 types of regimes, every type of regime called itself secular at one time or another. Separation of church and state. If one accepts that all the current members of the European Union, plus Norway and Switzerland, who are not members, are democracies that coexist with the twin tolerations, if you accept that, it's very useful to bear in mind that in this set of countries in Europe, they give substantively greater support to religion than is normally understood by the phrase strict separation of church and state. Just consider this table. It builds on Fox, but it's also my own data. This is the percentage of European democracies, 20 of them, that support. What do they do with their policies towards religion? Governmental funding of religious schools or education, 100%, including since 1958, France. Religious education standard, 76%. Government collects taxes for religious organizations, 52%. Official government department for religious affairs, 44%. Government positions for funding of clergy, 40%. Government funding of religious charitable organizations, 36%. Some clerical positions made by government appointment, and most astonishing of all, established governments, 36%. Established religions, 36%. Okay. With this in mind, it's interesting that many people still insist that some version of strong laïcité, French type, is absolutely necessary. Well, France hasn't been France. Strong laïcité in Europe is basically an empty shell. except France keeps coming back into it, but it's virtually nobody more than France. But it's interesting because people say, well, when you consider a country like Turkey, it should be something like France. They have that in mind because people like Ernest Gellner, my colleague at Central European University, has famously written that Islamic countries are secular resistant. All right? Well, they would be secular. It depends what secularism is. Now, in the literature, and I've got 15 direct citations of this, people say that Turkish secularism is very much like French secularism. And if you really secretly believe that it's hard for a Muslim country to be a democracy, then you want something like this. But what do they have? Just consider these 6 differences between Turkish laïcité and French laïcité. First, in Turkey, every single publicly read prayer for Friday ceremonies in mosque is written by one state office, the Diyanet. Second, in Turkey, all mosques that are allowed to be authorized, all mosques that exist are authorized and approved by the state, and everyone who works in them, all imams, are state employees and can be dismissed. Third, in Turkey, 2 large groups of citizens, constituting almost 25% of the population, Sufis, even though they're Sunni Muslims, as well as Alevis, and obviously Shiites, are excluded from financial support of Diyanet and, in fact, from the normal rights of religions. Matter of fact, it's illegal for Sufis and Alevis to build in public space at all. Fourth, in Turkey, the graduates of public Islamic Imam Hatip schools are not allowed to attend universities except the departments of theology. Fifth, it is banned in Turkey to teach the Quran to those under 12. Sixth, 50% of the citizens of the country, women who wear headscarves, are not allowed to attend any university if they walk in with a headscarf. Okay. Now, if this is what secularism is, you can imagine why Nehru, when he looked at it, said, gee, I like Ataturk, but that's too much. And anyway, Nehru knew that Ataturk didn't have a democracy from 1923. The first elections weren't until 1950, and Nehru and Gandhi were going to have elections right away. This was not on, this version of it. Okay. Now, are there other models of the twin tolerations that work in countries with large Muslim populations and avoid this hard religiously controlling secularism and still are compatible with democracy? That's really what I'm working on now. I'm working a lot in Indonesia, a lot in India, a lot in Senegal, Albania, and I've yet to go to Mali. What's interesting about all of these countries, with the possible exception of Mali, but I'm absolutely certain about all the other ones, is that these democracies with large Muslim populations have a totally different approach towards religion. Their religion is much closer to what Dan Philpott writes about, what Tim Shaw writes about, what Tom writes about, and Monica Toffler, and that is that a regime of political freedom and a regime of religious freedom. That's the most important thing, that combination. That gives some room for play within the system, for people to learn. People are now, Linz and I insist, no democracy in the world was ever invented with a majority of Democrats. People learn democracy. They have to negotiate it. Now, the Indian model has many problems, which we're just coming out with a 400-page book, which we discussed. But I'm going to discuss sort of some of the high points in the discussion. We'll talk about some of mine. And remember, India has the second largest Muslim population in the world, 150 million Muslims. Okay. The pattern they chose was recognize all religions in the public sphere, financially support all religions, but maintain, as Rajiv Bhargava says, a principled distance, not equidistance, because if some religion is violating human rights, like at independence, many of the Hindu temples would not allow untouchables in. Gandhi said, you're going to have to close that temple until they clean up their act. That's what democracy is vis-a-vis religion, okay? Now, all of these countries publicly recognize and celebrate virtually all the religions there. Indonesia is a slight qualification. By that I mean, basically, no European country has a single public holiday for a non-Christian religion, if you exclude Turkey, but not one of them has a single public holiday for a minority religion, okay? in a place where religion is considered very important for all the citizens. This is unacceptable. So, India has 5 for the major religion, Hindus, but 10 for the other religions. These are compulsory, paid holidays where the president participates in the celebration. Indonesia has 6 for the Muslim majority, 7 for the other. Senegal has 7 for the Muslim religion, but 6 for the very small Christian population, and Albania is going to follow this model, okay? They financially support all religions. That means schooling, charitable organizations, a whole range of things, financial support. This co-participation in many things allows a discussion with religion and democratic officials, but it even leads to some amazing things. The Hindu fundamentalist BJP government didn't dare change the classic Hindu Indian tradition, that is subsidy for Muslims to make the Hajj to Mecca. Matter of fact, the third terminal in Delhi is called the Hajj Terminal. Linz, Yugender Yadav and I just finished this book that's coming out, but we did a 31,000 survey, census-based, one of the largest surveys in the world that's ever been census-based. What are some of the findings on it? I mean, does this type of pattern of religious freedom, what is it, how does it work, and what are the attitudes? We did the classic 3 questions. For a country like this, democracy is always better than any alternative. For someone like me, it makes no difference, or sometimes an authoritarian regime is better than a democratic regime. Okay. We've given this twice, once with 27,000, one with 31,000, in the same survey that accurately predicted the elections. The result is that there's virtually no statistical difference between Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians in support for democracy, and in all cases, in both surveys, it's way higher than any country in the history of Latin America has ever been, except for Uruguay and Costa Rica, okay? Other things that come up in the finding is that many people worry about the religious intensity being working against support for democracy. So we created an index of support of a religious intensity, low, medium, high, and an index of support for democracy, and another index of support for non-democratic solutions. Our findings for Hindus, the greater the intensity of religious practice, the greater the support for democracy. I was nervous when I read the results for Muslims. The results are virtually the same, and for Sikhs and for Christians. All of them go, the greater the intensity of religious practice, the greater the intensity of support for democracy. By the way, the finding is the opposite, and that among Buddhists in Sri Lanka, for reasons that I don't have to go into, but they're understandable. And if you take a look at politics and religion, implications are highly contextual. For 95% of world history, since Muhammad, people have supported the same context exists in Pakistan and India in terms of the doctrine for Islam, the same geopolitical context, the same socioeconomic context, yet when we asked our question in Pakistan, less than half as many people in Pakistan, which never has religious freedom, or often does not, support democracy than in India. By the way, Bangladesh is much closer to India. Okay. We did regression analysis. Okay, if there are any specialists on Egypt, who's a really good specialist on Egypt? Oh, I needed a research assistant, but just think of this. Think of this. I'm just back from 5 weeks in Indonesia. One of the key things, my hypothesis is, consistent with the hypothesis that Tom talked about, is religious freedom is helpful for people developing a discourse that's compatible with democracy. I think 5 things. Indonesia, by the way, there are 10 countries in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. For the last 5 years, the highest ranked democracy, either Polity 4 or Freedom House, of those 10 is Indonesia, okay? It's a 2, okay? in Indonesia too, then let's think about what's the status of religious freedom and their action in society. My hypothesis is that for a country with a large Muslim population, especially a majority, and that's Indonesia, it's going to help if 5 things exist. Some writers, even if solitary intellectuals, devote learned scholarly works to explaining positive relationship between Islam and democracy. Okay? Second, it's even better if some of these intellectuals are public intellectuals and go on television, radio, and so on, and violate the Rawlsian thing by constantly engaging in a public discourse if there's about religion, particularly with people from their own religion who are saying that democracy doesn't exist. It's better still if some of these public intellectuals are members of civil society organizations like Muhammadiyah, which has 30 million members, or NU that has 40 million members, and have a great university that was founded independently of the state but negotiates with the state. If you're a member of civil society organizations like that, then you have constituents, you have followers, and you're harder to repress. Fourth, it's better still if these civil society, public intellectuals, have some relationship to democratic political systems. Now, in Indonesia, where I regularly have been talking for the last 10 years with at least 4 people who satisfy all 5 of these things. These are the presidents, Rais of Muhammadiyah, and the Speaker of the Constituent Assembly, who wrote a great doctoral dissertation at the University of Chicago in 1983 that starts with a total denunciation of any idea of an Islamic necessity of an Islamic state. Gus Stewart, a great pluralist and thinker, insisting on the fact that if diversity is a sociological fact, pluralism must be a political choice. And he goes into, he says, Islam supports this. But he's been president of NU. Nukulesh Mashid created Paramadima, twice elected president of the Islamic Students Association. He's the guy who invented Islam yes, Islamic parties no, and he's a great constant intellectual. And then, less well-known but very important, Shafi Marif, who I was recently with, and he brought all the religions together in a great anti-corruption, lifting up your hands, sort of Martin Luther King type of thing. It was terrific. Everyone was there. Now, the key thing about this is all of these people have been able to stay in Indonesia the whole time. They've been censored. They've been attempted to silence, but the cost of silence then was high. And in Dalian's sense, the cost of toleration, given this type of power, was less than the cost of repression, even for Suharto. So these people stay in their country. They argue every single day. And that is political freedom that's won, not given. And it's emerged in that way. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you. Great start to our proceedings. Thank you, Al. Jean Elshtain.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank the 2 Toms for the invitation to be here this morning, and thank Stepan for his very interesting presentation and for his article on which it is based. Now, his conceptual framework is attractive in many ways. As you heard, he doesn't shy away from controversial questions. For example, are all or only some of the world's religious systems politically compatible with democracy? And he is certainly correct that this is one of the vexing questions of our era. Now, in his article, he follows up his first question with a series of corollary questions, not all of which he was able to address. But finally, he wants to look at the minimal institutional and political requirements of democracy, and he also wonders what the implications of a response to that and a couple of other questions might be for, in his words, polities influenced by such cultural and religious traditions as Confucianism, Islam, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So Stepan, in other words, takes up issues that often pit scholars and analysts against one another, and sometimes the yield of that is illuminating, and sometimes it's merely bewildering, and sometimes tendentious. So there's admirable clarity that he brings to bear here. So the question that we were posed that Tim Shah and I were asked to answer in some written comments, and then to perhaps bring these to bear this morning, is how well these twin tolerations work out as a conceptual framework and as a way to evaluate what is going on the ground, so to speak. So let me be clear. Let's be clear about the tolerations first. Stepan mentioned them in passing, but let's go over them one more time. He condenses the tolerations as follows. What are the necessary boundaries of freedom for elected governments from religious groups and for religious individuals and groups from government? Right? Now, how this works out very much depends on how freedom is defined and whether the from, that is, protecting government from religion and religion from government, presupposes hermetically sealed off categories that don't bleed into one another, or whether instead one understands from to mean the disestablishment, that is, there is no official state religion, and there is no, therefore, intolerance, that is, they can't practice their faith toward other religions and so forth. That is, one need not assume that government is never to be influenced by religion. So what does the from mean here? How extensive is that from government being, in a sense, protected from religious groups to a certain extent? As well, if from requires from the side of religion that it is essentially private, that is, it's primarily to do with worship, and is primarily sort of inward looking, the faithful sustaining themselves over time, and it's largely invisible to the public square, that, of course, is a harrowing requirement that is impossible to work out in practice. Now, if from means, by contrast, that government cannot move in on a religion, so to speak, it can't try to change its creed or dictate its personnel or determine what it can and cannot say, that, of course, seems to me a kind of rock-bottom necessity for any vision of freedom and democracy in practice. And here I would say that Stepan is often very astute and very reassuring. For example, when he tells us that the Western European lesson lies not in the need for a wall of separation, but instead for the constant political construction and reconstruction of the twin tolerations. So separation of church and state as juridical entities, so to speak, does not create those hermetically sealed off categories, that is, religion and politics sort of separate from one another, that I noted above. Now, Stepan's institutional approach seems to me to flow in a direct line from John Locke's justly famous letter on toleration. In this famous letter on toleration, Locke distinguishes what he calls statescraft and soulcraft. Statescraft is the job of government, soulcraft is the job of churches. And that argument tends to work better if one assumes sort of religious bodies, religious individuals and bodies that, again, are primarily concerned, if not exclusively concerned, with their own freedom to worship, rather than with any robust engagement with the public sphere. That is, when you are confronted with, as Locke was, strong ecclesial bodies, in this case, namely Catholicism, with a robust corporate identity that have a history of engaging the culture in all of its aspects, then Locke begins to wonder if this is a church, a faith that can be tolerated or not. So he fretted about Catholics precisely because of that strong ecclesiology, that strong corporate presence. Also worried, the old canard, are they loyal to a foreign power? He found Islam outside the pale of toleration altogether because its adherents pledged loyalty to a worldwide ummah and to the leader of that ummah, so they cannot be full civic participants in a tolerant polity. Just as an aside, just to bracket this, but Locke also put atheists, interestingly enough, outside the boundary of toleration because he said atheists would not engage in the essential task of the moral formation of the young that democracy relies on and that it looks to religion to help to accomplish. So again, you have the task of religious groups, those that are to be tolerated, of raising the young with a kind of moral formation. Now, Locke's toleration, as I said, well, first I said what his was. Stepan does not repeat Locke on what churches or faiths are to be tolerated. Obviously, you heard that. But I wonder if Stepan's tolerations also work out a bit better if one thinks of, as I said, religious individuals and religious groups as essentially private rather than as robust public institutions of the sort that many churches and synagogues and mosques are in practice. And I'll tell you why I picked up on that. I think he and I have a little disagreement about this, I'm quite sure. But the reason I picked up on that is the following. Stepan writes, complete freedom to worship privately is what he has in mind when he's talking about freedom of worship. But again, private is precisely what a robust faith cannot be, unless the two of us are understanding what private means quite differently. So that might be something, who knows where the discussion will go, but that might be one issue. Now, in a short response, it's obviously not possible to address systematically the, in his words, potential sources of resistance to the twin tolerations in practice by majority religious communities. And those identified by Al as central, as you heard, were Islam, Hinduism, and Christian Orthodoxy. Now, I think one can say this much without fear of contradiction, namely that one's response to this question very much turns on what understanding of the faith one embraces, one has in mind. There is, I dare say this audience doesn't need to be told this, but no monolithic voice within these complex communities that settles the matter definitively. A robust response to the question then cries out for detailed historical and institutional, the sort that Stepan does, and cultural analysis that is richly descriptive and analytically acute and empirically solid. Pretty high standards one has to meet, I guess, by my formulation here. That is, you can't respond to this question simply abstractly. And one strength of his approach is he's looking to actual practices on the ground. For now, this much can be said. For the faithful, democracy will always remain a suspect category unless they find internal to their faith a repertoire of possibilities that can help to buttress and to sustain democratic hopes and claims. Needless to say, I think one has to add yet another complexity to this already daunting set of requirements, namely how democracy itself is understood. Are you working with a minimalist definition of democracy? You have to have at least this much. Or are you working with a more robust or maximalist definition where you have to have not just the following sort of procedures in place, but you need something like a democratic civil society in order for one to say in a steadfast manner, democracy, this is what democracy is, and they have it here. So that is something that's difficult to work out because one cannot expect democratic cultures in the full Tocquevillian sense to develop in places that have no traditions that, so to speak, can be filled out in that direction. That isn't their history. That said, inhibiting factors of the cultural sort can, it seems to me, be mitigated in practice given how one constructs institutional arrangements and requirements. That is, people learn democracy, and I think Stepan said something like this, learn democracy in the doing of it. That is, these practices over time can become habits that can perhaps turn into democratic virtues. That is, they can be sustained over time and help to make more robust that which starts out as something rather less. Were we to wait until cultures were fully democratic, we would be waiting for a long, long time. If, however, we assume that what Tocqueville called the habits of the heart develop out of engaging in certain practices over time, then the creation of democratic institutions and practices like competitive elections, free press, and so on, that makes it possible to generate minimalist democratic frameworks, and then hope that over time, if there is sufficient stability and time, that this will turn into a more robust understanding of a democratic society. One final set of considerations here, and that has to do with, again, the issue of religion and the private. I indicated a moment ago that faiths challenged by democratic urgencies, Islam, of course, is very much on our minds, will accept tolerations, will not accept a version of toleration that characterizes faith simply as a private form of worship. Islam is, as you know, a strong religion with a public presence. This doesn't mean that it need dominate over a polity, or that forms of theocracy that historically characterized much of the Islamic world should be reinstituted. Obviously not. But it does mean that a strong secularism of the sort that some still see as a sine qua non of democracy is unacceptable to the vast majority of the faithful. And here more elaboration is, I think, required yet again, but this must suffice for now. To accept that we live in a secular world, that is to say, we have a secular government, there is no establishment of religion, government is not entangled with official, religion is not entangled with an official established, wait a minute, the state is not established with an official religion. I hope that's clear. They're not entangled, in other words. So you've got separation of church and state, right? And you could say we have a secular state as a result of that. But this does not require driving a wedge between democracy and religion in practice on the level of society, on the ground. You simply cannot do that. Too much of the same territory is claimed by each. In a debate a few years back with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, I was concerned but not surprised that she framed the matter concerning religion and politics more or less in this way, quote, "What sort of religion and what religious practices can the state tolerate?" That for her was the guiding question. So religion came as a kind of supplicant to the state in this formulation. And it was the state's job to say what was or was not acceptable to it. And there was really no appeal, so far as I could tell, beyond or behind what the state had determined. Now, that's obviously not the stuff out of which robust toleration is made. I don't think she thought through the implications of her formulation at all. But her arguments, it seemed to me, picked up on themes in the work of John Rawls, mentioned by Professor Stepan, excuse me, that sees an inevitable clash between the claims of politics and the claims of religion, and religion must give way. Now, this is not the venue to debate Rawls, but I think this much needs to be said. Seems to me that Rawls was wrong about both politics and religion when he claimed that each is a giant monolith launching comprehensive claims. If we stand down from those kinds of formulations, the problem will get refracted in other less intractable ways. And I think that's the actual situation that we face. So I, for one, hope that the influence of Rawls, who was, of course, a great philosopher, and this takes nothing away from that, but that influence, I would hope, is perhaps on the wane, where our current debates about religion and politics and church and state are concerned, because I don't think, all told, this has been a very helpful direction or influence on those discussions. So to conclude, to the extent that the twin tolerations help to guide American foreign policy, I think it must be with careful elaborations in order to make it clear, especially to Muslim citizens, that they need not choose, and I think Al did that in his presentation, between an all-encompassing secularism or an all-encompassing faith. That separation of church and state institutionally does not require the separation of religion and politics on the level of civil society or in culture. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jean. And now Tim Shah.
I hope no one will think that there's any false modesty in my saying that it's more than a little disconcerting to be appearing on a panel with two of my intellectual heroes, Al Stepan and Jean Elshtain. I mean that in all seriousness. And preparing for this panel has been a very happy experience, in part because it's given me the happy opportunity to reflect on how much I owe to both of these individuals. But since the subject of our discussion today is Al Stepan's twin tolerations, I'll focus first on how much I owe to Al Stepan, whom I first met when I stumbled into a seminar he was co-leading with James Piscatori at All Souls College in the spring of 1998. And I believe during that seminar he circulated what I think was the very first draft of what became his piece on the twin tolerations. And I should say, as a Harvard graduate student in political theory, who had been force-fed heavy helpings of John Rawls's political liberalism, which has already been mentioned, including the idea that religion should as much as possible be removed from political negotiation and political discourse, I was completely unprepared for what Al had to say, not to mention the passion and the confidence with which he said it. His standpoint and his arguments blew into my intellectual world like a gale force wind, tearing down all kinds of otherwise unquestioned Harvard verities about religion and politics, not only the separationist liberalism of John Rawls, but also the anxious musings of Samuel Huntington, who was another one of my teachers. Huntington and Rawls in some ways were oddly similar, standing for the notion that strong revivalist religion of one sort or another, more Islam in Huntington's world, more Christianity in Rawls's world, is a presumptive threat to liberal democracy. You might say there was high anxiety in Harvard Yard about religion's influence on democracy, high anxiety that shot into the stratosphere, particularly, I think, between the years 1990 and 1997, 1998, and I think that anxiety remains somewhere in outer space even today. Though Al is no Pollyanna about the relationship between religion and democracy because he is at heart a hard-nosed empirical realist, Al Stepan's approach in the twin tolerations challenged and continues to challenge Harvard-esque anxiety about the religion-democracy relationship in profound ways, and to me, absolutely revolutionary ways. And he challenged this anxiety, and I thank God continues to challenge this anxiety with a virtually unparalleled authority as among the leading scholars of democracy, and in particular of the conditions and processes that make democracy happen, as well as the conditions and processes that make democracy robust, the conditions that lead to democratic transitions and the conditions that lead to democratic consolidation. So how does Al Stepan's concept of the twin tolerations challenge the Harvard Yard anxiety, not restricted to Harvard Yard as we know, that religion is a presumptive danger to democracy, democratic transition, democratic consolidation today? That religion, in other words, is democratically faulty until proven innocent. I think Al fundamentally challenges that notion in a number of ways. First, on the democracy side of the relationship, Al emphasizes that there are many ways political systems can institutionalize the relationship between religion and politics and remain within the bounds of democratic acceptability. We should not think that in promoting healthy democracies in which there is a healthy relationship between government and religion, that we are promoting some kind of cookie-cutter approach to democracy promotion or democratization. There is not one path to democratic salvation, as in Rawls's suggestion, that only one very narrowly defined set of liberal procedures will do the trick, or in a Huntington-esque view that only one kind of culture, Western culture, with its tradition of church-state separation will sustain democracy. No, there is not one path to democratic salvation, but many paths, many arrangements, including those in which there is some establishment of religion, as continues to be the case in many European Union countries, as Al Stepan has pointed out very forcefully and eloquently for many years. Second, as far as the religion side of the relationship is concerned, Al Stepan's approach is similarly latitudinarian, one could say. When it comes to the types of religion that are compatible with and supportive of democracy, Stepan sets up a big conceptual tent. Lots of religious systems, lots of religious traditions have elements of belief and history that are fully compatible with and supportive of democracy. This is, again, is in sharp contrast to John Rawls's view in political liberalism, where the requirements of what it means to be a reasonable, comprehensive doctrine, one, in other words, that's fully supportive of liberal democracy, are piled up very high and prove almost absurdly demanding. So much so that one is forced to conclude that the only people who could fully meet Rawls's standards of reasonableness are probably 7 or 8 aging Unitarians on the Upper East Side. In fact, a blockbuster of an article appearing in the journal Ethics in the mid-1990s by Leif Wenar concluded that almost no actual religious community could actually meet Rawls's standards of reasonableness and thus able to join his liberal overlapping consensus. So, again, in sharp contrast, Stepan offers a broad sense of democracy and a broad sense of religion. There are many conceptually acceptable forms of democracy, many institutional varieties of democracy. Equally, there are many democratically compatible forms of religion. But it's crucial to avoid a misunderstanding. Stepan's admirable broad-mindedness about both religion and democracy does not mean that his twin tolerations amounts to an empty, platitudinous relativism that says there are no universal democratic standards, or one that says that all religious communities, all religious beliefs, all religious traditions are equally democratic. Stepan does not say that, explicitly argues against it. In other words, though, the twin tolerations is a broad doctrine, it also has bite. It's demanding in some important ways. And that's why it's a useful model for U.S. foreign policy, which is what we're asked to focus on this morning. And the twin tolerations has bite in the sense that while it gives a lot of breadth and latitude to both democratic and religious realities, it also demands a great deal. And it demands a great deal in 3 specific areas, which I'll talk about now. First, it demands a great deal of would-be democracies. It demands a great deal of any political system that wishes to be fully democratic. Second, it demands a great deal of religious actors as well. And third, I think it demands a great deal of U.S. foreign policy. First, what does the twin tolerations demand of would-be democracies? And let me just, if I may, briefly read from Stepan's twin tolerations. The key area of autonomy from the government, or even from other religions, that must be established for religious freedom is that individuals and religious communities, consistent with our core institutional definition of democracy, must have complete freedom to worship privately, but more, as individuals and groups, they should also be able to publicly advance their values in civil society and to sponsor organizations and movements in political society, as long as their public advancement of these beliefs does not impinge negatively on the liberties of other citizens or violate democracy and the law by violence. This core institutional approach to democracy necessarily implies that no group in civil society, including religious groups, can a priori be prohibited from forming a political party. So, this is a very demanding doctrine. First, it demands, at the very bare minimum, that religious communities have the right to worship privately. But then more than that, Stepan emphasizes that religious groups must have the right of public organization and expression in civil society. They must be able to form organizations and groups and promote their values in civil society. But more than that, that's not enough either. They also must have the right to sponsor organizations and movements in political society, including political parties. And it is an absolute violation of democratic standards to deny any group a priori the freedom to organize its own political party to express its values in political society. Now, Al is very careful to say that this is not a democratic luxury. This is required, demanded, as the minimum core of what democracy entails. This is not a special set of freedoms or rights for religion. It's not what some of us know as, quote, religious freedom, which has gotten a bad name over the last 10 years. This is not special pleading for religious freedom or religious groups. This is part of the core requirement of what democracy demands. A society that does not permit freedom for religious organizations to organize, express, influence in civil society and political society doesn't just fail a test of religious freedom, it fails a basic test of democracy. A society that does not permit religious organizations to act in those ways may be many things, but it's not democratic. And we shouldn't pretend that societies that fail on that account are democratic. Well, the doctrine is also demanding of religious actors. And I'll just read briefly what it demands of religious actors. The key area of autonomy that must be established for democratic institutions is that the institutions that emanate from democratic procedures should be able, within the bounds of the Constitution and human rights, to generate policies. Religious institutions should not have constitutionally privileged prerogatives which allow them authoritatively to mandate public policy to democratically elected governments. So the twin tolerations demand something of governments, that they not impinge on the autonomy of religious actors, but it also demands something of religious actors, that they not impinge on the autonomy of democratic deliberation. And we should be clear, though, about what that means. It means that there are no religious trumps of democratic deliberation, as there is in Iran, for example, where you have a guardian council made up largely of clerics and a supreme leader who are able to trump and restrict, contain, limit democratic deliberation. But religion should be a full-fledged participant in democratic deliberation. It simply doesn't have the right to impose restrictions or limits, trumps, if you will, on democratic deliberation. Religion cannot restrict or short-circuit democratic deliberation. Finally, the $64,000 question, though. What does the twin tolerations demand of U.S. foreign policy? I want to begin to answer that question by reading from an article that appeared in the Washington Post in early October about Egypt and about dynamics that are occurring as we speak in Egypt. And I'm quoting from the article. The government of Egypt is escalating its crackdown on a variety of civil society groups and organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood. 16 Muslim Brotherhood members were detained on charges of violating a law that requires government approval to hold a political gathering. There were many other indiscriminate arrests of hundreds of Egyptian activists, many of them members of the Muslim Brotherhood. I continue to quote, "The Muslim Brotherhood's opposition to U.S. policies in the Middle East, as well as its popularity, ultimately helped to doom the Bush administration's push for political reforms," something that many of us are familiar with. American officials worried that the Islamists could one day replace Mubarak if democracy took root. Many activists fear that the Obama administration feels the same way and will legitimize what many expect will be Gamal Mubarak's ascendancy, Gamal Mubarak being the son of Hosni Mubarak, the presumptive heir to the presidency, in a nation that has never experienced a democratic transfer of power. We were hoping, I'm quoting, we were hoping Obama would be different than other U.S. administrations, said Gamal Aid, executive director of the Arabic Network for Human Rights. Quote, "But America is concerned more about stability than democracy." Well, that really is the fundamental challenge and demand, then, of the twin tolerations for U.S. foreign policy. And the demand is really a very simple one. What the twin tolerations demand of U.S. foreign policy is that it answer a very simple question. Is American foreign policy serious about promoting democracy, or is it not serious about promoting democracy? There really is no other question or demand. If American foreign policy is not serious about promoting democracy, fine. But let's be clear about what we are doing. Let's not be surprised also if many Muslims around the world resent the continuing hypocrisy of American foreign policy. Because we should remember that resentment comes at least as much from dashed hopes as outright hostility. Many in the Muslim world resented the Bush administration for what they perceived as its outright hostility to the interests of Muslim peoples. But if the Obama administration does not seriously promote real democracy in the Muslim world, I think it's clear that it runs another kind of risk, the risk of fomenting what may be an even more profound and bitter resentment arising from disappointed expectations. On the other hand, if we are serious about promoting democracy, we have no choice but to promote the serious, robust, structural freedom of religious actors, religious organizations, religious communities throughout the Muslim world. That's simply what democracy demands. And it's also what's needed, one should emphasize, to promote and encourage and permit the evolution of religious communities towards greater understanding of and better practice of democracy. The Roman Catholic Church evolved over 200 or 300 years towards a full embrace of democracy. If in every case where there was a large Roman Catholic population, the Roman Catholic Church faced tyranny, opposition to any form of civil and political expression on the part of the Catholic Church, how would the Roman Catholic Church have evolved towards an acceptance of democracy? I submit to you that it would not have evolved, or it would have taken much, much longer than it did. And it's clear that in cases where the Roman Catholic Church faced outright political exclusion, hostility, and oppression, that tended to breed extremism and tyranny in response. So it seems to me that American foreign policy has to answer this question, and if it answers the question in the way that I think it should, that a respect for religious freedom, for the religious freedom of actors and organizations and individuals is indispensable to advance the interests of the citizens and the countries that we're talking about, as well as the interests of the United States. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to ask Al Stepan if he would like to respond to what he's heard briefly. And then I'll ask if you would please bring the microphone up to the front, or how are you going to do this? You're going to put it up here? And if those of you who have questions would go to the mic once it's put up here, then I invite you to do so. Al?
I have very little to say. Tim raised the point that if there's this, I mean, everything she said I agree with, except for a slight overlooking of some things that are to some extent there. I mean, the freedom from, it's not absolute freedom from religion. It was very special to say religious institutions should not have constitutionally privileged prerogatives which allow them authoritatively to mandate public policy to democratic. That's the freedom from. You need that. And it's not absolute. Obviously, if you're in public society, if you're electing people, democratic officials are being influenced. And then it's right to say I did talk about worshiping privately, because that's absolutely crucial, but I immediately afterwards talked about publicly advanced and or sponsor organizations. So even in the original version, there's a much richer version now, but even the one that this poor man heard 10 years ago or so, I was anxious that we deal with institutions and not only private worship. Because the private worship thing, basically, the Supreme Court in Turkey has recently defined secularism, the legitimate action of religion can only be in your brain. They define it that way. And even in family affairs, you have no right to say anything about dress or food eating. So anything outside of the most immediate private one is unacceptable. So that's why they came within one vote of banning basically a Democratic Party. Now, what we also don't realize is that this Constitution was built after the 1980 coup, and it had 5 members in the upper house. The 5 members in the upper house were the only 4 members in all of Turkey that had the only 5 members in all of Turkey that had 4 stars on their shoulder: head of the army, the navy, the air force, and police. So they mandated this constitution that is the most extremely aggressive, narrow definition of secularism in the world.
Okay, I'd like to, we have a microphone that will be brought to you, so if you'll put your hand up high so that we can see you, we'll turn to the audience now.
Very much for being here.
If you would identify yourself and ask your question.
David Buckley from the Government Department here, PhD candidate. And a question really for any of you, although perhaps particularly for Professor Stepan. So about not the link between democracy and the twin tolerations, but between authoritarianism and the emergence of the twin tolerations within religious actors. So I've heard the argument made, and I don't buy it, but I don't know how to go back at it, that the reason that particularly in both Turkey and Indonesia that you see religious actors emerge who are willing to accept the restrictions on their own activities that come with buying into the twin tolerations is because they've emerged within, in the Turkish context, a strong military state that could make it clear that their first preferences for total religious control were off the table. And then in Indonesia, within a military dictatorship that very aggressively set the terms for cultural and religious engagement in the public sphere. So, what do you make of that argument?
It's probably, you'd want to, I think, reread the last 100 years of Indonesian history. I mean, to some extent, when you talk with any of these people, they are writing, all of them. All 5 of the people I mentioned have written doctoral dissertations. Therefore, you can read what they wrote. And they wrote it 20 years before they emerged as major public figures. So they argue, one person argues, absolutely, insists, page 1. This is Amin Rice, head of the Constituent Assembly. There is nothing that God told Muhammad about the structure of any Islamic state, and it goes on and on. Another person just says flat out that not only is there no Islamic state, but it would be against Islamic principles of justice, shura, consultation, if in an area, this is Gastur, if in an area that, and he gives a lovely example. He says, take a look at Indonesia and throw the map of Indonesia over the map of Europe. It's going to cover Dublin to Baghdad. He says, and we've got more than 22,000 occupied islands. Many of these islands are 100% Hindu, some are 100% Protestant, some are 100% Catholics. How are we going to live together with justice and peace in an Islam if we have an Islamic state? It's not going to work. So this is for their own reasons. It's not only the military. Many of these arguments happened before the military regime. Now, the military regime, the fact that none of these people have been killed, none are thrown out, but religion had enough power that there were some constraints in the public space, even on Suharto. And so you have to fight for the range of freedom you're given. So that's what I use the Dalian sense. They would have liked to repress these people. But if you're head of a 40 million member organization or a 30 million member organization and have, this is totally unlike Pakistan. Totally unlike Pakistan. The state covers all the space, okay? In education, literacy rate, right now, women, girls from 8 years old to 12 years old, males, 99% literate, women, 99% literate, okay? Now, everywhere there are Islamic organizations and the state in some type of competition with each other. But they are filling that, they fill that presence. And then they finally negotiate with the state for, okay, I mean, you have enough power to fund your own schools, to create excellent universities, by far the best university, the Muslim university, in terms of autonomy and creativity is in Indonesia, the State Islamic University of Jakarta. So it wasn't all given. That would be a mistake. And even in Turkey, hey, the coups were in 1960, 1971, 1980. These are coups. A lot of people were hung. They weren't, so it's in this context that you begin to keep struggling. But when you take a look at the opinion poll, only about 15% of the people are total Ataturkist. Only about 30% really would like even an Islamic influence party. The majority of the people are sitting in the center. So as long as electoral competition continues, it will always constrain a party itself. So it's not only the military. Democracy will constrain that party, and the desire to get into Europe will constrain that party. So democracy is more constraining than the military. And my first 3 books were on the military. I'm no pushover on military regimes. I write about authoritarians. My first books were on Brazil and Chile. So,
Gene or Tim, would you like to?
But just briefly, the argument that Muslim actors will only be democratic essentially if they have a gun to their head doesn't explain why Muslim actors in, say, Mali and Senegal have been pro-democratic, because they have not faced similar pressures, but they nevertheless robustly, sincerely promoted pro-democratic doctrines.
Never been a military government in Senegal, never been a military government in Brazil. I mean, in India.
Just very briefly, listening to my colleagues who are far more expert country by country than I am. One of the luxuries of being a political theorist or political philosopher is you can kind of float above, you know, the empirical stuff. But at any rate, it was, and make pronouncements, you know. But at any rate, one of the things that was very interesting that I was hearing is the way in which many of the decisions on the ground are a combination of principled commitment and sort of pragmatic analysis of the situation. And I think that's a salutary warning both to political philosophers not to make things too neat and the formulae too tight and abstract, but also I should think to policy makers when they're thinking about these kinds of issues to realize that there's always room for negotiation and adjudication. And I think Al in his article, and I quoted him to this effect, about the constant sort of negotiation and renegotiation that goes on. So that's what I'm hearing here, that there's a lot of that that helps to determine the outcome in these situations.
Okay, Professor Casanova.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really exciting conversation. I think that, Al, there is one ambiguity which I would like you to address. I think the advantage of your framework above secularism framework is, of course, that it does two things. One, it's a dual principle, like the dual clause of the First Amendment. It's not only a principle of separation, but it's a very strong principle of free exercise. And so without it, and the free exercise principle is always more important for democracy than no establishment principle. So this is the really important aspect, and that in this respect improve also over the dual clause because it is too much restricted with the no establishment principle. And the second is, of course, that by talking of twin tolerations, you avoid the discourse of establishment church. You open up a culturally open framework which allows also for non-ecclesiastical forms of religion to be incorporated better. The ambiguity is you still talk of twin tolerations between government and religious authorities. And it is over the word of authorities, which is the question here, because it raises the issue of which kind of religious authority we can have. Namely, on the one hand, it is also an improvement to talk of government authorities because a state is simply too constitutionally restricted. It's much more important, really, to talk of legislatures, of government, etc. So what I mean by authority? When you have Republican religions that have no established ecclesiastical authorities, let's put it this way, then I see no problem with the definition. When you have, however, and this is the question that Jean also asked, types of ecclesiastical institutions that have this authoritarian structure, only if the system, and this is of course the advantage of democracy practice, that it may allow the laity, let's use the Catholic principle, to organize even against the religious authorities. And this, of course, is the triumph of Catholic parties in Europe, that were able to develop despite the antipathy or attempts of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy to control it. So there is an element in which, again, I think with Sunni Islam, there is less of a problem because it has no established authorities. When you have Shiite structures in which you have a very strong ulama, then there is an element in which the discourse of religious authorities concedes too much. So there has to be some then principle of disestablishment to precisely allow the freedom of religious actors from the religious authorities. So I just want to address this issue of your wording of religious authorities here.
As always, that's a very good question. My focus is probably less on religious authorities than on democratically elected authorities that have certain competences. So, the American Catholic Church, of which one time, I'm a Roman Catholic, one time I was a member of the American Catholic Bishops Association after Vatican II, totally different than Vatican I. Okay, Vatican II, in the idea of magisterium, teaching body of the church, would include even a lay person, if you'd ever been a member, and have something to say about it. Now, the American Catholic Bishops Association has come out absolutely as a authoritative body against a whole series of population policies that democratically elected officials say, look, we hear you, but we've been elected to do something else, and we have the authority to. So I mean, there's some tensions like this, and so what I specifically say is that religious authorities should not be given constitutionally embedded prerogatives to overturn democratically elected officials. So that's my major concern. And I'm also, but what happens if you don't have authorities in some place? I mean, you know, like Muslim. Well, that's also interesting, but so I don't think it revolves around the difference in authorities, because authorities can be against and have been. And I mean, some positions, Father Hesburgh, actually at Notre Dame, and I was a trustee at Notre Dame, there are some things that he cannot accept. But he doesn't feel that the fact that he can't accept it means that he should necessarily have the democratic right to impose it and insist on this for everyone else.
In response to that excellent question, I thought of Indian personal law. India is a kind of model case in much of Al's work for very good reasons, but there's arguably a difficulty and arguably a violation of Al's twin tolerations with respect to religious personal law, and specifically with respect to Muslim personal law, because even though Hindu personal law was reformed at Nehru's behest in the 1950s, essentially reform was forced on the Hindu community, Muslim personal law has never really been systematically reformed, because in effect Muslim ulama in India have a specified set of authorities under Indian law, have exclusive right to interpret, codify Muslim personal law, under which Muslims have to live. And of course, Muslim personal law in many respects has been very discriminatory of women, and this has created a very difficult issue. And I think this does pose a serious challenge. How, in that context, is the twin tolerations interpreted?
A terrific question, Jose. And as I was listening to your question and to my colleague's response, I was thinking, and again, this just may be one of the things that political theorists do, of medieval Europe and the centuries of contestation between regnum, temporal rule, and sacerdotium, or spiritual authority, and how you had the expansion and constriction of claims, you know, coming from each side, and again, the sort of jousting that went on for centuries over how you adjudicate the claims of these mutual authorities, again, because they claim so much similar territory. Now, I know that's not the world that we're in, but interestingly enough, in one of his justly famous essays, John Courtney Murray, in We Hold These Truths, an essay, Is There One or Is There Two, I think something like that is the title, argued that if you're really going to talk about the freedom of the church, which means a freedom from the sorts of things that Al is talking about, you have to think of the freedom of church authorities, and the freedom of the church as an authoritative institution that has a robust sort of place to be in the civil society, and that requires, again, this strong institutional presence and strong authoritative presence, and that if you want to get that out of the way, like the Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court did, you know, say, well, what does the state tolerate? So the state trumps in every situation, that over time will erode, in fact, the true sort of freedom of the church as it was historically understood and defined over time. Now, how that pertains in given circumstances would have to be worked out on the ground. But I think that point has to be made ongoingly, because we tend so much, you know, to slide toward the view that the problem should be easy to solve because religion is essentially private. And I think it's much more difficult to solve than that.
Just quickly, it also is important that there be rights of exit. If there's an authoritative religious community that is under a very robust form of authority, and that institution or community has a very important role in civil society and politics, and if people essentially are forced to remain in that community, even if they do not wish to, if the government connives in that situation, conspires to make it effectively impossible for people to leave a religious community, then that's a serious problem for democracy itself, and not, again, just for so-called religious freedom.
And then you're also eradicating the existence of the different types of authority because you're melding them into one, which is exactly what Courtney Murray was arguing against. And in order to preclude that development, you know, you need this strong institutional presence. It might be in some other circumstances that institutional presence is overweening and tangles too much officially with government, and, you know, sort of some shrinking back would be in order.
How appropriate. I'm afraid we're, just as this is getting interesting, we're out of time. I'm going to let Al Stepan have the last word here, but just commenting on the appropriateness of John Courtney Murray being brought up at the beginning of our conference. Al, please.
My father read John Courtney Murray to me.
Yeah.
Okay?
Good dad, good dad.
And not only that, he had 7 kids,
Lucky
and he
man.
insisted on subsidizing the 2nd edition, and my mother was furious with him. She said,
You've got
you've
7
got 7
kids.
kids.
What are you doing?"
What are you doing doing this? Since Tom has written a lot about the International Freedom of Religion Act, I'll close with just one or two. It's a difficult thing. I mean, and what might be appropriate and what might be inappropriate. And this, given my so I'll give West Java, where I just came back. Okay, in the local tradition of hundreds of years is that if there are 10 Muslim families in an area, they should create a mosque, and you should, because worship is communal, you shouldn't build another mosque until you at least have 1,000 families there. Okay, because so they could, everyone goes to one place. At the moment, huge tension, because Pentecostals, evangelicals, some from the United States, but some Indonesian, are coming there and in an amazing evangelical competitive moment are building, asking under freedom of religion rights, the right to build churches. So they have, even though they're only 1/10 of the population of the Muslims in that area, they now have 4 times more churches. It's actually close to 10 times more churches. I believe that if the Protestants insist on building new churches in the name of freedom of religion, churches are going to start being burned down. So it isn't prudential for the U.S. Embassy or for the U.S. to come in and support that in a context where we understand, because I go to Brazil, and you can, a small town in Brazil may have 15 Pentecostals, often in competition with each other. So, but this is, now, what they should do is, despite my 5 champions, oh, by the way, the answer so far on Egypt is no one's ever found one person who's in all of those 5 areas. Many intellectuals, many public intellectuals, no one in it. So I was dying if anyone would have defended it. Okay, but even though all of my intellectuals have condemned the mob attacks on Ahmadiyya as a sect, the president has been reluctant to stop mobs burning down Ahmadiyya churches. That seems to me a totally appropriate area. And the stoning decision in Aceh, which is terrible, it's totally appropriate to say, oh, by the way, you have a constitutional court, you have a home ministry. This is a violation of the Constitution, even though they have the right for, they should make a decision on that. So you should talk about a violation of Aceh. No one will ever be stoned, but that the fact that it exists was passed by the outgoing Aceh legislature before the Free Aceh movement, GAM, was in it, is outrageous. And the fact that if you burn down, allow burning down of churches, even because you consider them a sect, and the state doesn't exercise the legitimate monopoly of force and stop this, this is just an absolute violation of democracy. And we can talk about that. I think that's appropriate. It's not appropriate to defend what is seen as a foreign evangelical major religion. That's one of the reasons I was always upset. In Bulgaria, we have more American proselytizing missionaries than Orthodox priests. And it's one of the reasons that the Bulgarian church sought out, just at its moment of independence from the state, sought out the embrace. Ditto, it happened. I'm not blaming the Freedom of Religion Act, but in Russia, because this embrace, the effort to be re-embraced by the state, happened, there were only 4 years of total religious independence. Then there were so many people came in, outsiders, proselytizing. They said, hey, please, Mr. Yeltsin, please, Mr. Putin, protect us against all of these people. So they lost that historical moment of freedom where they should have created the capacity to resist, self-finance themselves, appoint their own people. I mean, there's a reason that no important Orthodox Christian religion resisted in that entire period, whereas Lutherans did, Catholics did, and that's it, they don't have any autonomy. So you need structural autonomy, which we'll talk about later. Thank you.
That's it for you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for raising the issue of proselytization. At the very end, just a moment here, I want to take this opportunity to say that properly understood, international religious freedom does include the right to proselytize. I see some of my brethren out there shaking their heads and nodding and so forth. Somebody ought to hold a conference on the issue of religious freedom and proselytization, and I think we'll do that next semester. So back in this space, maybe we'll ask Stepan and Jose Casanova to join us for that. Well, please join me in thanking our panel.